Sometimes the scariest enemy isn't lurking outside your door, but inside your home, eating at your table, and tearing your soul apart. My name is Eleanor Rodriguez, I'm 73 years old, and I've worked my entire life to build a decent home. I never imagined that in my old age, I'd be breaking my back to support my ungrateful son. 10 years ago, when my husband died, I was left alone to carry the weight of this shack with its peeling walls, but full of memories dear to my heart. Michael, my only son, was supposed to be my support, my pride, but he's become such an unbearable burden that sometimes I feel like it's about to crush me. I work as a cook at a large factory a few blocks from here. Every morning I get up before dawn, trudging through puddles and mud, often returning home soaked to the bone under the relentless rain. And Michael sleeps soundly, oblivious to my exhaustion, waiting for me to shake money out of my pocket for his cell phone, internet, and his destructive habits. He didn't want to study, didn't want to start a family, only left behind a son somewhere, a boy growing up far from his irresponsibility. When my strength fails me on the way back home, I seek solace in memories of the stability Michael and I dreamed of, a well-deserved rest that never became a reality. At 43, Michael is still clinging to me like a drowning man to a straw. His jobs don't last longer than 2 months. His friends, those useless freeloaders, only remember he exists when they need to drink and kill time. And I, with my aching bones, pay the bills for this entire company. Today, peeling off my wet clothes, feeling the cold seeping into my bones, it dawned on me. Either he finally becomes a man, or I kick him out of this house, into which we've put so much work and tears. I won't let him continue to steal the remnants of my life, even if it means losing the last thread connecting us. That same night, listening to his drunken laughter and the clinking of empty bottles, I realized, war in my home is inevitable. Sometimes loving too much is a mistake, leading to the deepest sorrow. Standing by the window of my bedroom, I look at the wet street, at the lights dancing in the puddles, and at the staggering silhouette of Michael approaching. He stumbles, dragging his feet, like a lost child. I leaned back on the pillows, allowing myself a short respite. A heavy sigh escaped my chest, but I desperately fought the approaching bitterness. Where did it all go wrong? In my memory, he's a cheerful boy, running around the yard, with burning eyes promising great things and a carefree old age for me. Childhood vows, naive dreams, scattered to dust. The door creaked, and he entered, as always, without a greeting, without a glance, throwing his battered backpack on the sofa. The heavy smell of alcohol permeated the air, mixing with the dampness of his clothes. What kind of night awaits me? A furious crash of broken dishes? Or tears of repentance and empty promises, as before? I silently got up, picked up his backpack from the floor, and carried it to the corner of the dining room, as if lifting an unbearable burden of unfulfilled hopes. While I heated up the soup on the stove, his heavy steps approached. Without looking at me, he held out his hand, demanding dinner as something self-evident. No please, no thank you. He just took the plate and collapsed in front of the TV, furiously changing channels, as if trying to tear out pieces of the night just to avoid seeing himself. In the dim reflection of the window, I saw him, the shadow of the former Michael. A broken man, mired in grievances, preferring to blame the world instead of building his own life. My heart clenched with pain, but the fatigue accumulated over the years whispered that the decision must be carried out, even if it tears me apart. From the kitchen, watching his sleeping figure, I understood that this hearty soup might be the last I serve him in this house. Tomorrow will be a new day, a day of change. The alarm clock, merciless as always, blared at 5 a.m. Every cell in my body begged to stay in the warmth of the bed, but I forced myself to get up. My bones creaked like dry branches underfoot, reminding me of the years lived, but I had no right to weakness. Slowly, with heaviness in every movement, I put on my kitchen robe, saturated with the smell of grease, onions, and honest, exhausting labor. Outside the window, the rain didn't stop, drumming on the roofs, foreshadowing another damp day. I knew I would return home soaked to the bone, with frozen feet and an even more frozen soul. Before leaving the house, I looked into the living room. Michael was sleeping on the sofa, peacefully snoring, like a child unaware of worries. Around him, like a sad altar, stood empty bottles. The screen of the turned-on TV cast ghostly, colored reflections on his haggard, prematurely aged face. I quietly approached, trying not to disturb his sleep. Covering him with an old, worn blanket, I involuntarily lingered, stroking his hair, saturated with the smell of beer and the bitterness of defeat. At that moment, through the haze of exhaustion and disappointment, I saw my child in him, lost, confused, trapped in a man's body, never having managed to grow up. Walking towards the factory, avoiding treacherous puddles, inhaling the tart scent of wet earth, I felt each step echo with betrayal. Betrayal of myself. I was breaking my back at work to feed someone who doesn't appreciate, doesn't respect, who is blind to my sacrifice. Every lunch, made with love, every peso earned with sweat and blood, every tear, furtively wiped from my eyes, it all seemed to fall into a bottomless abyss. Love had long given way to a crushing sense of guilt. The fear of abandoning him to his fate, as if his failures were a stigma on my soul, haunted me. Stepping over the rusty gate of the factory, I made a silent vow, this would be one of the last times I sell my life to fuel his indifference. That day at the factory was unbearably hard. Scalding steam from huge pots enveloped me like a suffocating shroud, and the hellish heat made my clothes stick to my body. Every knife I picked up, every tray I carried, pierced my heart like a sharp splinter, reminding me of my hopeless fate. My colleagues, young and full of life, chattered about the future, about families, about dreams. And I, at 73, felt like an ancient ruin, bound by icy horror. What will happen to Michael if I stop providing for him? One thought pulsed in my head, I have to. When the working day came to an end, the sky was covered with leaden clouds, and a nasty, chilling rain began to fall. Shivering and huddling in my old, faded coat, I almost ran home. My legs trembled treacherously, but every cold drop that lashed my face seemed to sober me up. While I, breaking my back, earn a piece of bread, Michael is probably sleeping peacefully, thinking of nothing but the next bottle of beer. Passing a dark store, I accidentally glanced at the window and saw my reflection, a hunched old woman with a faded look, as if carrying an unbearable burden, a mountain of pointless sacrifices. My heart clenched with pain and resentment. Quietly, trying not to make noise, I opened the door to the apartment, hoping that Michael was asleep. But I was deafened by a burst of laughter, like a punch in the gut. Again, these gatherings. Michael had brought his friends again. The acrid stench of cigarettes, cheap alcohol, and marijuana permeated everything around. My living room, my humble fortress, had turned into a dirty den, where these parasites, grinning brazenly, devoured the food I paid for with my life. A wave of despair and impotent rage rose in my chest. I wanted to scream. No one paid much attention to me. No one offered me a seat. Only Michael, with a slight smirk, raised a can of drink in greeting. I stood at the entrance, slightly wet, tired, feeling awkward, and at that moment I realized that a significant change had taken place inside me. There are experiences that do not manifest externally, but deeply affect the inner world, leaving it changed. I stood there, watching these people disregard what was once important to me in this house. Michael gave a soft laugh, and one of them turned the music up loud enough, filling the space with an energetic rhythm that made the walls vibrate slightly. My hands, slightly chilled from the moisture, began to clench involuntarily. How did such a change occur? At what point did Michael stop being the kind child who was happy to see me return? When did he become this person who looks at me without any visible sign of gratitude? I slowly headed towards the kitchen, moving across the floor, which was covered in their footprints. Each step required more and more effort from me. I made coffee, not so much for warmth as to maintain my composure. A voice came from the common room, reminding me to make him coffee too. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying not to show my agitation. "I'll bring it now," I replied, trying to speak calmly. While the water was heating, I felt my heart pounding, caused not by physical fatigue, but by a growing sense of inner protest. When I entered the room with the cup, he didn't pay much attention to me. He just reached out, not looking up and not expressing gratitude. I put the cup on the table almost silently. For a few moments I watched him in silence, trying to remember the expression on his face, his gestures. At that moment, I realized that good feelings alone are not enough when there is no reciprocity, and that one-sided concessions can lead to a feeling of oppression. That evening, lying in silence, I made a difficult decision. After some time, Michael will not be able to stay in this house. The following days were filled with internal tension. Every morning I got up with some effort, feeling the approach of a certain moment. While going about my daily routine in the kitchen, I pondered the words I would use to tell Michael that he needed to find another place to live. I had rehearsed this conversation in my mind many times, but I understood that no amount of preparation could completely soften the blow. Michael continued to live his life as usual. He slept late, had guests over, used the internet extensively, consumed food from the refrigerator, and wasn't always mindful of cleanliness. He made no attempts to find work, didn't talk about future plans, and seemed to show no desire to change anything. With each passing day, his inaction became more noticeable, as if he subconsciously relied on the support of a loved one willing to accept him as he was. This time, the feeling was different. Instead of the previous sentiment, I felt a new surge of energy, the source of which was the difficulties I had experienced and the opportunities one had lost. One evening, as Michael and his friends animatedly discussed a sporting event being broadcast on the television I paid for, I retreated with a notebook and pen. I began to record everything I had invested from the beginning, the time spent caring for him, the help in difficult situations, the financial investments in times of hardship. Each entry was significant, highlighting my efforts and pointing to the need for change. Quietly weeping, I allowed tears to leave marks on the paper, as if saying goodbye to the past. Closing the notebook, with hands still wet from tears, I realized it was time to act. All that remained was to gather my courage and express my thoughts openly. At dawn, as the sky was just beginning to lighten, I sat at the table with a cup of coffee. Michael was still asleep on the couch, holding an empty container as if it were something precious. I watched him in silence, feeling an internal struggle between affection and resentment. It was not just physical exhaustion, but also sadness from realizing that my son saw me more as a source of support than a loving mother. I remembered the past, the time when he said he would take care of me one day, that he would be able to provide me with a peaceful life. Those words now seemed like mere memories. With each encounter, it became harder for me to recall the child I had cared for in his youth, the young man who had experienced setbacks. Now, before me was an adult focused on himself, oblivious to the problems he had created in our lives. I took a deep breath, gathering my courage, and thought about what I would say. No reproaches, no raised voices, just an honest and direct conversation. Michael had two paths. To find suitable employment and take responsibility for himself, or he would have to consider changing his place of residence. There would be no room for pleas or unfulfilled promises. This time, I decided to prioritize my well-being over caring for him. And as the coffee maker completed its cycle, I decided that I would inform him of my decision that very evening during our conversation, without the possibility of reconsideration. That evening, I waited until the last of his friends said goodbye, leaving echoes of their conversations in the living room. Michael, looking tired, settled on the couch. I calmly approached and sat opposite him, asking him to turn off the viewing device. I wanted nothing to distract from the seriousness of the upcoming conversation. In a calm voice, I explained the situation to him. My exhaustion, the need to maintain my health, the years of work after retirement. I said that it was time for him to grow up, that he should look for work, help around the house, or he would need to live separately. I tried to speak calmly, choosing my words as if testing their strength, knowing that each one would have consequences. Michael listened, frowning, with a tense expression on his face. When he replied, his tone was sharp, full of resentment and irony. He reproached me for being overly emotional, for exaggerating, mentioned the financial difficulties they were facing. He let out a short, joyless laugh, as if he did not realize the seriousness of the situation. He expressed concern that I wanted to abandon him, called me inattentive to the family, but I no longer perceived his words. They seemed distant and unimportant to me. I understood that my decision was final. That same evening, locked in my room, I heard noise and his angry outbursts, unaware that this was the beginning of change. The next morning, there was tension in the house, as if after an unpleasant event. Michael did not speak to me all day. He secluded himself in his room, closing the door loudly enough. I tried to go about my business, preparing food and tidying up the things he had left behind, as if eliminating the consequences of his inattention. Inside, I felt a familiar feeling of sadness, which was not expressed in tears, but rather felt like a weight that you simply learn to carry silently. Towards evening, Michael came out of his room and stopped in front of me with a disgruntled look. His voice sounded accusatory, as if I were responsible for his failures. He talked about how I was leaving him, that I wasn't giving him enough attention, that I was inattentive to his needs and only thinking about myself. Every word he spoke was painful. But I didn't object. I no longer tried to prove anything to him. I realized that someone who doesn't want to change will always find reasons to blame others for their problems. That night, Mikhail left, expressing his dissatisfaction, and closed the door behind him. He didn't share his plans, didn't consult, and didn't show any concern about returning. I stayed in the living room, listening to the sound of the clock that had been there for many years. In the silence, I pondered my role, analyzing whether I had done enough to help him become independent. Perhaps my care was excessive, and it affected his ability to cope with difficulties. But I understood that I couldn't constantly shield him from the consequences of his actions. That night, as the wind howled, I decided that if Mikhail came back, I wouldn't greet him as before. Mikhail didn't return that evening or the next day. 2 days passed, and an unusual silence settled in the house, bringing both pain and relief. I slept with the door closed. I calmly prepared food. I cleaned the house, as if getting rid of negative memories. Despite everything, I occasionally looked towards the door, wondering if he would return and ask for another chance, which I was no longer willing to give him. On the third day, I heard the distinct sound of his footsteps on the stairs. I froze, trying to remain calm. The lock turned, and a man entered, looking tired, with reddened eyes and the same familiar feeling of failure emanating from him. He had no words of regret, nor did he have any new assurances. He seemed to carry the burden of old problems that didn't seem to resolve with time. Without looking at me, he went straight to his room, leaving his bag in the hallway, as if nothing had changed. But it wasn't the case. I already felt different. That evening, while doing housework, I decided it was time for a change. I took out a folder from the drawer where the house documents were stored, the contract that had been obtained with great difficulty, signed jointly. A document that confirmed that this house was mine, that I had put in a lot of effort to create a safe place, and now this piece was being questioned by someone who should have been a support, not a source of concern. Running my fingers over my husband's old signature, I realized that it was time to safeguard his legacy, even if it meant disagreements with my own son. With the first rays of sunlight barely penetrating the window, I sat down at the table with the folder open. I took a deep breath, as if preparing for an important step, and started making phone calls. First to an authorized representative, then to a lawyer recommended by a colleague. I aimed to avoid mistakes, not wanting to leave any legal opportunities that my son could use to get what he had no right to. Every word they said echoed with a slight sadness, but also strengthened my resolve. My son, as usual, didn't get up early, while I quietly managed affairs. All day he stayed in his room, only coming out briefly for a snack. I didn't interfere. I didn't want conflicts, I didn't want arguments, I wanted to act calmly and with the confidence of someone who had already experienced a lot. My actions were thoughtful, my words were measured. With each passing minute, I felt less discomfort and more confidence. I could no longer live in anxiety, in regret, with the feeling of guilt that limited me. Towards the evening, I sat in front of the screen and mentally planned my next steps. I will provide him with an official offer, so there is no room for misunderstanding. If he doesn't accept it, he will have to reconsider his plans. And if he doesn't want to do it voluntarily, I will be ready to turn to specialists to find a solution. This is no longer just care. This is a woman tired of supporting a man who doesn't show initiative. I closed my eyes for a moment, for the first time in a long time feeling a strange calm that came from within. And as evening approached, I prepared a document that would affect our lives, and left it in plain sight, awaiting a reaction. The next morning, the sound of the door closing echoed through the house. The document had been found. His exclamation, full of surprise and disappointment, echoed through the rooms. "What is this?" he said from his room. I continued to prepare my coffee, unhurriedly, trying not to let his words trigger my old feelings again. My hands trembled slightly. Yes. But it was a different tremor. The tremor of a person ready for a difficult situation, remaining calm. He entered the kitchen, holding a crumpled piece of paper in his hand. His gaze, expressing discontent and disappointment, was directed at me, as if looking for a reason for conflict. He expressed his disagreement with harsh words. He spoke of ingratitude, of oddities and contradictions. He claimed that after everything he had done, while being here, I was trying to make him leave. Every word sounded unpleasant, but none made me change my mind. I looked at him attentively, feeling a strange feeling for this person who considered himself a victim of his own actions. When he finished expressing his claims, I spoke to him with a calmness that seemed to confuse him even more. I told him that this was not a spontaneous decision, but the result of a long period of difficult relationships, inattention, and self-centeredness. I tried to calmly explain that I needed more personal space and time, and that he should learn to take responsibility for his decisions or find another place where he could rethink his views. I tried to avoid harsh words and emotional displays, maintaining the calm of a person who had made an important decision. Michael's gaze expressed strong dissatisfaction, and I felt that he might try to create certain difficulties, and that we would have to go through a difficult period. Michael left the house in a state of great excitement, hitting a piece of furniture and expressing his outrage aloud. I didn't interfere, considering it useless. I stayed at the table, slowly sipping my cold coffee, watching the play of light and shadow on the floor. I understood that the situation would not be resolved quickly. Michael was in a state of emotional shock. He will not easily accept the changes. He will look for ways to express his protest and make me feel the consequences of my decision. Soon the calls started coming in. First from distant relatives whom we rarely saw, with similar, expected remarks. "How about Michael, Eleanor? He's your son." In every word, there was an old resentment, those unspoken obligations that society places on mothers. But this time I didn't give in. In a calm voice, I thanked them for their concern and asked them to refrain from commenting on what they had not experienced. They don't know what it's like to watch your child gradually change year after year. Then came unpleasant messages from Michael's acquaintances, those who appeared when there was an opportunity to take advantage of something. They reproached me, saying that I was doing the wrong thing towards my son. Some even hinted that I should reconsider my plans. I kept every message, every unkind word, as if collecting evidence of a confrontation that was no longer based on affection, but had turned into a struggle to save myself. I remained calm. My life experience has taught me a lot. Losses have made me stronger in the face of the malice of those who prefer to destroy. That day, returning from the store, I noticed damage to the front door and assumed that it might be related to the actions of the person identified as Michael. Discovering the ajar door and the damaged lock caused me concern. I went inside, trying to remain vigilant and suppressing the growing sense of anxiety. There was an unfamiliar smell in the house, a mixture of tobacco smoke and mustiness, as well as signs of disorder. In the living room, I saw the consequences of the recent chaos: scattered objects, open cabinets, shifted curtains. My home, a place created with great effort, was subjected to the destructive energy emanating from a person who did not want to admit his mistakes. Michael was in the dining room. His expression was tense, and his breathing was labored. There were traces of drinks and food on the table, and his gaze reflected a state of depression. This was more than just discontent, it was a manifestation of deep sadness. Noticing me, he made a quiet, sad sound, asking if I thought I was still in control of the situation. He spoke of rules, of equality, of how I, in his opinion, should help him, given his life path. It was unpleasant to listen to him. Every word reminded me of how the person I once hoped to see had changed. I didn't react to his words. I took my phone and, trying to remain calm, called support services. I understood that this was a difficult, unpleasant, but necessary decision. While we waited, he continued to say harsh words, some of which were very offensive, but I tried not to show my feelings. Michael was no longer someone I should care about, he was an adult who should be responsible for his actions. The sound of an approaching car heralded that the situation might soon be resolved. When the law enforcement officers entered, Michael took a step towards me, and his gaze read a clear rejection, which indicated that the situation would not be resolved easily. The law enforcement officers entered, examining the premises. One of them looked at me, as if asking if I was sure of my actions. I nodded affirmatively. Michael, expressing strong disagreement and indignation, stated that this was his place of residence, that I had no grounds to demand his departure, and that everything happening was a ridiculous mistake. His words were harsh and unpleasant, but they couldn't inflict any additional pain on me. While law enforcement representatives explained the relevant rules and possible consequences to him, Michael looked at me with an expression of extreme dislike. He didn't try to reach an agreement, didn't express regret, but only made demands, as if he had every right to do so. It was difficult. My son, in the presence of law enforcement officials, expressing negative emotions. And yet, I didn't shed a tear, because I realized at that moment, sadly, that the problem didn't start that night. It had been brewing for years in every manifestation of selfishness, in every lack of attention, in every restrained dissatisfaction. As the authorities led him away, his words still echoed in the walls. "You'll remember this, you ungrateful wretch. You'll have a hard time." I closed the door, trying to remain calm, although inside I felt a strong surge of emotion. I leaned my forehead against the cold surface, allowing the silence to reign again, palpable and oppressive. This wasn't the end of the difficulties, I knew it. It was just the beginning of a new stage, a stage in which I would have to learn to live without the feeling of responsibility for the past that haunted me. That night, sitting in front of the window, I realized that the main task wouldn't be to change the situation, but to cope with everything that would happen in the future. The silence in the house was very noticeable in the first few days. Every object seemed to remind me of past events. Everything seemed to look at me with unspoken reproach. I moved slowly, like someone who had found themselves in a changed environment. But gradually this feeling turned into something else, into an opportunity to catch my breath, into a period for self-analysis, into a subtle feeling that for the first time in a long time I was in control of my life. It didn't bring joy yet, but it gave hope for improvement, breaking through the remnants of. I started with small actions. I opened the windows to air out the room. I tidied up each room, without haste, but with the peace of mind of someone completing an important stage. I gave away unwanted clothes, got rid of things that had become obsolete, removed from the walls photographs that evoked sadness rather than bright feelings. Each bag of things taken out reduced the burden that weighed on me, weakened the invisible ties that held me in the past. Gradually, this place ceased to be a place of confinement and became my home again. Sometimes, in the evenings, anxiety tried to creep into my thoughts. What if the past comes back and repeats itself? But it no longer constrained me. I no longer felt like someone who avoids difficult situations. Now I was a person who had faced a difficult choice in order to find inner balance. I decided. I knew it was him trying to get in touch, perhaps with hope for change, perhaps with new difficulties, but I no longer felt responsible for his well-being, no longer considered it my duty to correct the consequences of his decisions. I realized, sadly, that sometimes caring means needing to distance yourself, that there are situations in which not only attachment is important, but also self-respect, which is restored over time. And as the candle burned out, I realized that the real trials were still ahead, and this time I wasn't going to back down. The next morning, I went out into the garden, determined not to let anxiety affect my actions. The air smelled of damp earth, and the sun was just beginning to break through the clouds. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed Michael Rodriguez crossing the street, approaching slowly, as if afraid that the door would close before him. I remained in place, continuing my task of gathering the fallen leaves that the wind had brought together, as if it were an ordinary day, as if life held no further challenges. A figure approached and halted a short distance away. His appearance was worn, his eyes shadowed, his clothing disheveled. He did not resemble the individual I remembered. He seemed more like someone who had lost their way and was seeking direction. He spoke my name quietly, his voice barely audible above the breeze. He used a familiar term, as if that single word could undo past events. I paused, but did not respond immediately. I completed my sweeping, collecting the leaves into a bag. Only then, with composure, did I meet his gaze. I conveyed that I harbored no ill will, that I wished him well, but that I also recognized the need to protect myself from further emotional distress. I explained that this home was more than just a structure, it was my sanctuary, a hard-earned achievement after a life of dedication, and that this achievement was not something to be relinquished. It was no longer in the hands of someone who failed to appreciate the kindness shown to him. Tears welled up in his eyes, but it no longer elicited a strong reaction from me. It wasn't an expression of animosity, it was a necessity, a final acceptance of himself. Mikhail Rodriguez lowered his head, muttered something unintelligible, and I knew it was the last time he would appear in my garden. I watched as Mikhail Rodriguez slowly walked away down the street, his silhouette stooped under the gray sky, never once looking back. And I didn't call out to him either. I quietly closed the garden gate, realizing that this symbolic gesture also marked the end of a difficult period in my life. I felt no triumph, no joy, only a profound sadness mixed with a strange relief, like a person finally shedding a burden they had carried for so long that they no longer remembered how heavy it was. I entered the house, now truly mine, and walked through each room as if surveying the landscape after a storm. Yes, there were marks on these walls. Yes, there were reminders of raised voices, distress, unfulfilled expectations, but there was also sunlight entering the windows, fresh air moving through the hallways. Above all, there was room for me, for aspirations I had set aside, for a life that, although delayed, could still be meaningful, peaceful, and independent. A life for myself alone. That evening, I prepared a simple meal, put on soft music, and sat down to eat deliberately, appreciating each portion, like someone observing a ceremony of renewal. I reflected on my partner, on all we had accomplished together, and I felt that in some way I was respecting their memory by safeguarding what we had worked so hard to achieve. I didn't know what the future would bring. Perhaps more solitude, perhaps more challenges. But for the first time in a while, I didn't feel anxiety, I felt serenity. And that serenity, that quiet achievement, was my true success. Turning off the light in the living room, I resolved that I would never again permit anyone to diminish my self-respect, not even under the guise of affection. Often, genuine contentment lies not in regaining what's gone, but in discovering the fortitude to begin anew. As time went on, the home regained its warmth, mirroring my own progress. The garden's blossoms reappeared. Birds returned to fill the mornings with song, and the air within felt lighter. I, too, began to flourish gradually. I enrolled in a culinary course for adults at the local center. It was an activity I'd long desired but never prioritized. For the first time in years, I possessed the time, vitality, and autonomy to focus on my own well-being without reservation. Some neighbors, aware of the situation, offered encouraging words, invitations for conversation, and kind gestures that reminded me of my connection to the community. I learned to appreciate solitude, to stroll calmly along the street, to observe sunsets without the weight of concern. I learned that restoration is always possible, that choosing serenity over constant self-denial is valid, and that self-compassion is essential. I discovered that an individual like myself, even at this stage of life, can experience renewal and growth. Occasionally, I reflect on past acquaintances, wondering about their current circumstances and future prospects. I harbor no ill will towards them, but I also understand that I am no longer responsible for their life journey. Each person has their own unique experiences and challenges. After many years of quiet struggles, I have chosen tranquility as my guiding principle. I have chosen to embrace the remaining time, taking ownership of my life, my space, and my schedule. I have chosen to experience a sense of independence. This decision, while sometimes solitary, feels like a courageous step. Today, as I write this, seated on the porch with a warm beverage and enjoying the sunlight, I feel content. Not because everything has been effortless, nor because everything has unfolded flawlessly. I feel content because after a long period of dedication to others, I have come to appreciate the importance of personal well-being. This realization brings a sense of joy that cannot be diminished.